and welcome everybody to At Lunch. So, like many people, I have watched the huge exodus of people from Venezuela to the United States and to New York in particular with pain, with foreboding, and I admit with intense curiosity. How did this come to be? And it so happened all this was happening while I was reading a terrific new book by William Neuman, our guest today. As a reporter for the New York Times, Willie spent 4 years living in Caracas, Venezuela as Andes Regional Bureau Chief. This experience led to his beautifully written account of Venezuela's decline and the history behind it. The title, in some ways, sadly, tells a great deal of what that history entails. Things are never so bad that they can't get worse. Rebecca's going to post in the chat a link to where you can purchase the book, and I highly recommend it. Willie's a great writer. It reads like an excellent novel with not the happiest ending. And also, Willie and I are both children of parents who were forced to leave their countries, and we share a particular interest in refugees and the conditions that result in their exodus. Willie, I'm so delighted that you could join me for At Lunch today. And so I just want to start off, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background. You were at the New York Times for many years as a reporter. You started covering real estate and you became a city reporter. You wrote a lot about Bill de Blasio and then off to Venezuela. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about how you got from there to here again.
Well, thank you very much. First, I wanted to say thank you to Julie and to Rebecca and to the American Jewish Historical Society for having me on today. I'm very excited to be here, so thank you. So the question is, how did I get here and how did I end up in Venezuela? Well, I guess it goes back. I had started out as a journalist in Mexico because after college, I was interested. I had always been interested in Latin American literature and I'd learned Spanish. And so after college, I went to Mexico and I began translating the novels of a Mexican mystery writer named Paco Ignacio Taibo. And I was living in Mexico and I needed a way to make some money because you don't make much money doing translating. And I had a friend who was a reporter, and so she got me some work, and I ultimately ended up stringing from Mexico for the San Francisco Chronicle and the Fort Worth Star Telegram, and so that's sort of how I got my start. And then I ended up in New York, and I was at the New York Post for 11 years, and then I went from the Post to the Times. And one of the great things about the Times is, and about journalism in general, is that you get to do all these different things. And so I went to the Times as a real estate reporter at the real estate section. And from there, I went to the metro section and was the transit reporter writing about the subway system and transportation issues. And then I went to the business section and I wrote about the food business, the food industry and agriculture. I used to say that I wrote about all of New Yorkers' obsessions because I wrote about real estate, the subway, and food. And then after that, I got sent down to Venezuela, and it was very exciting for me because I'd always wanted to go back to work in Latin America ever since I'd come up to New York from Mexico. And so for me, that was a great opportunity. And I was in Venezuela from 2012 to 2016. And I covered the Andes region. So I covered Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Also jumped in to help out with reporting in a bunch of other countries in the region. But I was living in Caracas, and at the time, the greatest amount of news was out of Caracas because Chavez was president and he was like a news magnet. So anyway, so I was there. After my time as a correspondent was over, I came back to New York, and that's when I covered City Hall and covered de Blasio. And then in 2019, I had the opportunity to do the book. And so I went back, I left the Times at that point, and I went back to Venezuela and spent a lot of time in Venezuela in 2019, which is a really crucial year, and started working on the book. But you know, I mean, I was very fortunate in the timing of things because I went to Venezuela in 2012, and which was the last political campaign of Hugo Chavez. And then Chavez dies in 2013, and his protege, Nicolas Maduro, becomes president. And that's when the crisis starts. And so I got to see the boom years under Chavez, when in 2012, the price of oil was $120 a barrel. Venezuela is an oil producing country. It has more oil than any other country in the world, although today it produces very little because of the crisis. So I got to see the country when things were booming, when people were prosperous, and I got to see Chavez in action. And then I got to see the beginning of the crisis and then watch it over the years as it continued to deepen and get worse. And as the book says, you know, there were so many times, especially in 2019 when I was working on the book, and people would talk about how bad things were, and you know, oh, we've hit bottom, they would say. And I would say, no, you haven't hit bottom, because if I talked to you 3 months ago, you would have said you would hit bottom, and now it's worse. And the quote comes from a conversation with somebody where they said that. They said things are never so bad that they can't get worse. That's the lesson of Venezuela, unfortunately. At least it has been so far. But, you know, being a foreign correspondent is just the best job in the world, because you get to travel. I mean, I traveled all over Venezuela, and you get to talk to people who you would never run into otherwise. I traveled all over the region, and it's just exciting and stimulating, and it's just a real, it's something that few people get to experience.
So let me ask you something following up on that idea of being a foreign correspondent. I mean, you became a foreign correspondent well into your career.
Mhm.
And so you said the Times sent you down there. I guess there's a couple of parts to this question, which is one, you know, had you indicated that that was something that was interesting to you, or they knew you spoke Spanish, or how did that come to happen? Like the magic hand of God of the Times decides, oh, let's send Willie down to Venezuela. And also, just tell people a little bit about what it's like. I mean, your book is so knowledgeable and delves into the history and so on. And yet, you know, you had covered a lot of different things, food, real estate, that were not necessarily about the history of Venezuela and Latin America. And I was wondering if you could just describe a little bit, what's it like to just sort of land in this country and say, now I'm going to explain Venezuela to the readers of the New York Times?
No, that's a great question. Well, I guess, I mean, in a way, my career started as a foreign correspondent because it started down in Mexico. And so in a way, I'd always wanted to go back to that. But, you know, it was also quite different because when I was in Mexico, I was a kid and I was, you know, writing stories mostly out of Mexico City. And when you're a foreign correspondent for the Times, you know, I was traveling all over the place and covering breaking news, doing investigative pieces, you know, features, all sorts of stuff. So it was a much richer experience the second time around. But like I said, one of the great things about the Times is that there's so many opportunities inside the paper. And so you do something, you know, our mutual friend Trish says the thing about journalists is that they have a short attention span, and they just like, that's why the Times is so great, because you jump from, you know, you do something for 3 or 4 years and then you go on to the next thing inside the paper. In other words, a new topic to cover. And when I went down to Venezuela, I had never been to South America before. I'd always been interested in it. But when I started the job, it was all new to me. And I was very conscious of that fact. And I was conscious of I wasn't going to go in there and be the know-it-all who, you know, who could tell everybody what it was like. For me, the job was discovering what it was like and understanding how to explain it to people. And I was also very conscious because Chavez was such a controversial figure, and he'd been written about so much in the US media. And I didn't want to go in there and just sort of accept the received wisdom and what everybody else had written. You know, Chavez is evil, Chavez is great, whatever. I wanted to learn for myself. And so I went through a very conscious period in the first, you know, many months of really getting to know the place, traveling a lot inside the country, talking to lots of people on both sides of the Chavez opposition divide, because it's a deeply divided country. And that's one of the key things about Venezuela. And it's a cautionary tale for the US because it shows what happens in a deeply polarized country, and where that can go. And we're sort of on the beginning of the road, or close to the beginning of the road that Venezuela's been going down for quite a long time. But so it's really, your job is to dig down, understand, learn things, and your job is to explain the country to people. But you have to have a lot of humility and know what you don't know. When I was writing the book, and there's a portion of the book about US policy towards Venezuela, and a lot, when I was writing it, Trump was president, and or the period I was covering, Trump was president, and there were a lot of key decisions made in the White House and the State Department. And after a certain point, there was nobody in the White House or the State Department at the upper levels of decision making on Venezuela who had ever set foot in Venezuela, with the exception of the person who eventually became the ambassador to Venezuela out of Bogota, after the US closed the embassy, who had been there for a few months. And so you watch these people making decisions from complete ignorance and yet arrogance, thinking that they have all the answers and they know what's going on. People like John Bolton. You read John Bolton's book where he describes the decision-making around Venezuela, and it really didn't matter to him that he knew nothing about the country. He knew what was the right thing to do. But anyway, as a correspondent, I mean, that's the gift of it. You get to travel around, you get to meet people, you get to really dig in and understand. And I was fortunate enough to be in the country at a really crucial time. And when I came back, I was always thinking, well, is there a book here? How do I tell this sort of larger, more complicated story to people? And then in 2019, when Venezuela became really big news because Juan Guaido, this young legislator, essentially, as an act of defiance toward Maduro, said that he was the head of the legislature at the time, and so he was the president of Venezuela, the legitimate president, because Maduro, in his re-election, had essentially engineered a fake election so he could have a second term. Fake isn't quite right, but he essentially disqualified all of his opponents and magically won the election. In any case, so it was front page news. It was big news, and that's when I was able to sort of set the book, especially in the context of that crisis and the collapse of the country and the refugee crisis that was going on at the same time. So there was a lot. There was a lot to tell. There were a lot of stories all at once.
Yeah, and I will say, one of the things I love about the book, you can order it in the chat online. It's such a good book that it is full of stories. You don't have to know much about Venezuela besides what you've read in the New York Times to appreciate the book. But what I love about it is it does fill in so many gaps. And just, there's a chapter that goes back to far off history, and then you learn about Simon Bolivar, and then you start to see the connecting the dots leading up to today, which is really fascinating. And I want to return to that in a minute, but I also, this is the American Jewish Historical Society, and one of the things that we do like to look at is the history of the American Jewish experience, which is a very, very wide-ranging one. And interestingly, in your particular case, your family's background is very much, I think, linked to the issues that really your book leads up to, which is this enormous, tragic exodus of people. I think something like 20% of Venezuela's population has
a quarter of the population has left the country.
A quarter now. I mean, just unbelievable. And so if and I was wondering if somewhere in your psychology or something, if tell us about your father's odyssey, and whether you think that somehow connected to your own fascination with Spanish language and culture, or that may just be me playing amateur psychologist. But anyway.
No, I'll tell the story. I mean, my father was born in Germany, and the family got out in 38, very late in 38, sort of just in time. And the U.S. was taking very few Jews in at that time, and so they went to Cuba, and they stayed in Cuba for a year. And my dad was bar mitzvahed in Cuba. And later on, much later, as a reporter, I was reporting out of Cuba, and I went to the synagogue where he'd been bar mitzvahed and did a story about sort of the attempts to sort of maintain some kind of Jewish culture on the island. And then after a year in Cuba, they were able to come to the United States. My dad's father had a couple of brothers who lived up here, and they went to New York and then on to Chicago, which is where I grew up outside of Chicago. But there's an interesting part of that story, which, I mean, one of the things about this is that my father never talked about the past. And I think that that's a very common experience of a lot of children of Jews who left Europe. It seems like there's some who never talked about the past and some who never stopped talking about it, maybe that as well. But in my experience was, he was very silent. There was a wall that came down. And I think it was such a traumatic period that he just shut it all out. And that was the way that he was able to sort of survive as a survival mechanism. And so we didn't have a lot of details about any of this stuff. And one detail came out much later. A cousin of mine, Michael, when he was graduating college, Michael's mother was my dad's sister. So Michael went to Yale, and at his graduation, apparently at Yale, it's common for the students to get a prize or an award as part of the graduation. And so Michael was at the graduation, and they call him up, and he was given an award called the Rabbi Stephen Wise Award. And Stephen Wise was a very prominent rabbi in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And so he takes the award, and he goes back and he sits down with his parents, and his mom is crying. And he didn't understand because he didn't think that getting an award was such a big deal. And he said, well, what's going on? And she told him a story that none of us had ever heard before, which is when at the time before my dad and his family left Germany, his father, my grandfather, had decided that the family would stay there. He had been a soldier in the German army in the First World War, and he was convinced that demonstrated that he was a good German citizen and that would protect him. And so they were going to stay. And at some point in 1938, my grandfather and his wife, my father's stepmother, went on a cruise in the North Sea. And on that cruise was an American rabbi. And they became friendly. And the rabbi spent the entire cruise pestering my grandfather to convince him that they had to leave Germany. Wow. And they came back to Berlin after the cruise. They decided, okay, we are going to leave. And that's when they finally did go in maybe September, October of 1938. And that rabbi was Stephen Wise, the American rabbi. And so when my cousin gets the award at the ceremony, his mom tells my aunt, his mom tells him that story. So I don't know, it's interesting to me how so many of the people of that generation, and I never really thought of my dad as a refugee. I mean, he was my dad, right? I mean, I was aware of, where he came from and that they had gone to Cuba and then to the US, but not many more details. But it's interesting to me that mechanism that a lot of people have to sort of shut off the past and not talk about it. And I actually read a fascinating book this year by a Venezuelan woman who has the same last name as me, Ariana Neumann. And she tells in her book a very similar experience where her father was born in Czechoslovakia, went to Venezuela after the war, he was Jewish, became a successful businessman, never spoke about his past, never. And when he died, she found a box with all these mysterious documents, fake ID cards and all sorts of stuff. And she spent 20 or 30 years hunting down this mystery and piecing it together and finding lost family members. And she wrote a book called When Time Stopped, which is a great book. And it tells the story of her father and what he did to survive in the war in Prague and then in Berlin. And but one of the things that fascinates me is that, my father from Germany, her father from Czechoslovakia, my father in the US, her father in Venezuela, but the exact same kind of behavior in terms of, the way that these guys survived was to, put a wall there. And life began when they started their new life in the new country.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And it kind of leads me to the next question, which is, I know you've had an opportunity in the last few days, actually, to meet with some of the refugees who came to New York from Venezuela. For those in the audience who don't know or haven't had a chance to read about, there's been a lot of refugees coming into Texas who the Texas governor has chosen to continue their journey on up here to New York. And, you said something really profound, I think, in this answer, that you never thought of your dad as a refugee. This was just part of his history. And yet we tend to see, Venezuelan refugees, and that kind of becomes this lumped in category instead of, this is 20,000 people who have shown up here and they have families and they have histories. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your more recent experience meeting.
Well, the Venezuelan refugee situation is, I've been following it closely for quite a while, and it's very interesting what's going on now. Some of the background is essentially in Venezuela. My book is it's really about the crisis in Venezuela. So it was very important to me that not be a book about Hugo Chavez, because many of those books have been written. It's about a book that happened after Chavez. And to understand it, you need to tell the story of Chavez and oil and Bolivar and all that, but it's much more recent history. And essentially Venezuela had a double crisis. The Chavez dies, who had been leader for 14 years and this charismatic figure, the center of political gravity in the country. And that begins his political crisis because his protege Maduro, who at the time was very unsure of himself and inexperienced in the executive role and uncertain, takes over. So that's the political crisis. And then oil is everything in the Venezuelan economy. And so a year after that, the price of oil crashes, and that starts the economic crisis. And so you had this sort of parallel crises of politics and economics. And once the economic collapse starts, you get hyperinflation in the country, the kind of thing that, we all remember from, stories of Weimar with, there weren't people rolling wheelbarrows of cash down the street, but stores would raise their prices once or twice a day. At its highest point, I think inflation was maybe 350,000% a year. The numbers mean nothing. Essentially, your money is worthless. And so malnutrition, extreme shortages of goods, there was nothing in the stores to buy. People would line up to get into the stores and they would buy whatever was there so that if they didn't need it, they could sell it to somebody else and then get some money to buy what they needed. A black market for everything, prices extremely high in the black market. And at the same time, a tremendous devaluation of the currency. So there was hunger, there was malnutrition. People had work, but the money was worthless. And so people start to leave the country, and they mostly went to other South American countries. And since all of that started, really the people started leaving around 2015, 2016. More than 7 million out of 30 million Venezuelans have left the country. So that's a quarter of the country. And that's you see that in countries at war. You don't see that at countries at peace because of an economic crisis. So they went to Colombia, they went to Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, but not many were coming to the US. And then just recently, in the last year, they started coming to the US for a couple of interesting reasons. It seems to be the people who are coming here, some are coming from Venezuela because things are still very bad there. And some are coming from other countries where they went, a first or a second or a third country trying to find some way to get by, and now they've come to the United States. And it used to be, and most of these people are coming over land, and it used to be that people couldn't get from South America to the United States over land, because in order to do that, you have to go through Panama. And the border between Panama and Colombia is this very dense, mountainous jungle with very rough terrain and rivers, and it was considered impassable. First off, nobody went through it. There was no trail through it. And so it was physically impassable, but psychologically, people thought it can't be done. There's no way to do that. And then some people started to go through, and essentially, enough people started going through that they cut a trail through. And then more and more people went through. And now the trail is like a highway. It's not paved, obviously, and it's extremely difficult still, but they showed that it could be done. And then because of social media, they went on social media and they went on TikTok and they said, look, we're going through the Darien Gap in Panama. We're headed to the United States. Look, we got to the United States. We made it through Panama. And so more and more people started to go. A lot of it was fed by social media. So much of it, I think, was that psychological barrier. We can't go. Oh, well, now we can. A couple other things happened. You had the change of administration in the US. So you went from this sort of extremely severe anti-immigrant message from the White House to, a change of tone and attitude. Also, people realized that the US was taking any Venezuelan who crossed over essentially could stay, because the US had cut off diplomatic ties with the Venezuelan government. And so they didn't have a way to send people back home like they do with a lot of other countries. And so that fed this migration. And so you had, now I'm forgetting the number because I haven't looked at it recently. I want to say that 150,000 people, maybe through the first 7 or 8 months of the year, Venezuelans crossing over the southern border, when before it was a few thousand. So they came in this, in these waves, and you had a couple different things happening. The Texas governor, and then more recently the governor of Florida, to try to sort of play politics with these people, were in Texas. They were putting them on buses up to places like New York or other northern cities. The famous one was the airplane to Martha's Vineyard, paid for by by Florida taxpayers, but by DeSantis in Florida. But you also had a lot of people, there were other ways they came up too. I know that the city of El Paso, which is a Democratic city, was putting a lot of people on buses to New York because they just simply didn't have the resources to deal with them. So they were showing up in New York by the hundreds and then thousands, and New York didn't know what to do with them either and wasn't prepared, and so was putting them in homeless shelters. I was this week, I volunteered at a shelter to talk to some, and I talked to some of these people, and these people are essentially economic refugees. A lot of them are, the process is you arrive and you apply for asylum. And that sort of sets a clock ticking that ticks for a very long time because the system is so overloaded. But they're essentially, for the most part, economic refugees. The big difference now is that Biden essentially closed the border to Venezuelans, what was it, a week ago, 2 weeks ago? And he's returning them to Mexico, essentially, where they're supposed to wait for an asylum appointment. So now the thousands now seem to have become a trickle. But in talking to these people, they're not, I think a lot of them are in a very different situation from, for instance, a lot of Mexican and Central American migrants who come here already have family here. So they come here and they have a certain sort of base that they can operate off of. And a lot of the Venezuelans who are coming now don't have that. And so they get here and they almost seem disoriented. And they come here with this idea, oh, well, we're going to work and make some money, and then maybe when things get better, we'll go back home. So everybody that I talked to was desperately trying to find work, and it's all off the books work. I talked to one guy who had, I guess by luck or personality, had found steady work and was working every day washing dishes in a restaurant. But the other people I talked to were, either had found nothing, or they would find things, here and there. So you get this sense of they went through this whole ordeal of going through Panama, and then through Central America and Mexico, and there's a lot of violence, and there's gangs along the way, and there's that terrible passage through the jungle in Panama. And then they get here, and on the one hand, they're very fortunate because they get 3 meals a day in a shelter in New York City, but they're in this limbo, and they could be here for years. I've had friends in Venezuela who, when things have been really bad, have said to me, that they wanted to leave. And I always said to them, be very careful, because it's so much harder. As bad as things are in Venezuela, you're going to go to another country, you're going to have nothing there, you're going to have no work, no home. And it's very hard to get started again. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much for this. And, sort of leads me to another question, which is, in the 4 years you're there, I mean, now we hear of, I sort of remember growing up, Venezuela always was someplace you thought of as glamorous, or, something like that. And, obviously now we just think of some terrible situation going on where, things are not going well. And I was wondering if, you could tell people what are the things that that people love about it, or that were there positive things about it in the 4 years that you were there? I mean, how much of the regular life has been able to go on even in the middle of this crisis, or has it?
No, I mean, I'm actually, it's a place that I love very much. I had, I lived there for 4 years, and I've gone back many times since, and I have great friends there. The people are wonderful. It's a Caribbean country. So the weather is just amazing. It's like summer all year long. Caracas is a beautiful green city. Venezuelan food is it's delicious and varied, and in ways that few people recognize, similar to Mexican food or cuisine or Peruvian. It has a real sort of pre-Columbian roots in the arepa and cassave and yuca and other things that date back to before the conquest. And it's the landscape is incredibly varied. They have the highest waterfall in the world. They have beautiful plains, mountains. The Andes cuts up through the western part of the country. Beaches. And it's mostly the people. The people are just incredibly special. It's a very warm country. In a lot of the sort of Andean countries, they're sort of defined by the mountains and this sort of, they're much more sort of inward looking and closed in and colder, both in terms of climate in a sense, and not cold in terms of the people, but in a different. Venezuela is a country of extroverts, and they're very quick to take you in and sit you down and feed you, and so all of those things, to some, they sort of captivated me and drew me in when I went there. I mean, I know that in the book, there's a young woman, Marlon, who's a student, who talks about how Venezuelans have changed through the crisis, and the extreme crisis, the hunger, the failure of basic services. There's no electricity, there's no running water, you can't get gasoline for your car. And at one point she said to me, it used to be that, if somebody came over to your house, you would sit them down and you would feed them, or if you were having a meal, you'd invite them to join you. And now you don't do that because you don't have enough food for yourself or for your family. Wow. But even so, the last time I was there was a year ago in November. You still find that very warm quality in people. I mean, another thing about Venezuela actually is that it's always been a very open country. Venezuela is not a country that created immigrants, did not create refugees. People went to Venezuela, people from all over. During the oil boom of the 1970s, people went to Venezuela to live there from all over Latin America, especially Colombia and Peru and other countries as well. And it received people. And so it's very unusual for Venezuelans to leave their country in this way. And also there's a lot of European influence. A lot of Europeans went to Venezuela after the war. Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, and Germans too, or Jew, including German Jews and others from Europe, like the family that I mentioned. So that's one of the wonderful things about it. It's just so open to the world, and you really get that sense when you're there.
Is there still much of a Jewish population there?
There is. I think it's somewhat diminished. It's not something that I've followed closely. It's there. It has a presence. It was never a really large community, and I imagine that it's shrunk some now. But it's still there.
So I'm curious, one of the things that your book is punctuated with these chapters on blackouts, which to me just sounds horrifying. I mean, I think here, in all the years I've lived in New York, we've had a couple of blackouts and everybody just freaks out, and yet you make it sound like it's sort of now just part of life. And I was wondering, just from a writer's point of view, when you're putting together all this material and figuring out how to do it, that the blackouts to me feel like they're sort of some kind of refrain that's coming through like a piece of music. It's sort of the not very happy chorus that comes through now and again. And I was wondering, for you, what do the blackouts represent, both metaphorically and actually in real life?
Well, when I sort of conceived of the book, they hadn't happened yet. And so I started thinking about, doing the book in early 2019. And then in early March of that year, the power goes out across all of Venezuela. And in Caracas, I mean, the entire country was blacked out. And in Caracas, the power was out for about a day. And in other places, especially in the far west of the country, in the second biggest city called Maracaibo, power was out for 5 days. Then they finally got power restored. And then a few days later, it went out again all across the country. And they got it restored. And then a few days later, it went out again all across the country. And then throughout that year, the grid remained very unstable, and it went out again, I think, in July, and then there was another blackout, and then in between those, there were local blackouts, there were brownouts, there was power rationing. So it was this very unstable situation, very disconcerting to people, because if the power goes out, you think, oh, it'll be out for a couple hours, and then it stays out all day, and then another day, and another day, and especially at the beginning, people didn't know what to expect. And so, I spent a lot of time in Maracaibo, which is the city that was hardest hit by the blackouts. And people talked about this very disorienting effect, especially the first time around, of there was no communication from the government or the authorities. And they never knew when, it was days go by, and then you run out of food, and then you can't buy food. And it just became very, it sort of showed people the intense vulnerability of their lives there, and sort of felt to people like a symbol of how the country was going backwards. And so for me, it was, because I was there during this period and talking to so many people involved in this, I talked to people who were affected by the blackouts. I was very interested in Maracaibo. There was a lot of looting during the first blackout. And I was curious about that because I wanted to understand how somebody could go from being a neighbor and a customer of a store one day and then to being a looter the next day. So I talked to a lot of people who had been involved in the looting. I talked to people whose businesses had been looted. And then I was just sort of, and then I ended up finding a bunch of guys who had worked for the electrical utility who helped bring the electricity back on. And so I talked about that end of things as well. And it just became, it was such a compelling set of stories and all these different perspectives on the same thing. And then I think, to me, as somebody watching it and as a writer trying to tell this story, and I think to a lot of Venezuelans at the time, it became very symbolic. It became this metaphor of darkness, a country, perfect metaphor for crisis, a country falling apart, a country like hurtling back to a previous century, this sort of decay and disintegration. And also just the idea of power. I talk in there about how, so much of this relationship between the government and the people has to do with power and who has power. And so the electricity as a form of power became a symbol of that as well. And then when I was writing the book, I had all this material and I didn't quite know how to put it all together. And, to some degree, you're trying to tell a story chronologically. And so I wanted to help people understand how Venezuela got to the point of this crisis and collapse. I needed to tell the history of the country and, how it became an oil-focused country and, independence and Bolivar and Chavez. But then I was worried that the reader would be reading all this old stuff at the beginning when really I was trying to tell a new story. And so I used these individual pieces of the blackout story, different people's stories of what happened during the blackout, as this kind of sort of spinal column that runs through the book. And that was a way to sort of very quickly introduce present day events interspersed, especially early on in the telling the history of the country. And then as the book goes along, you sort of catch up and it all becomes more current.
Thank you. That was great. We're almost at the end of time, but we're going to go over a couple of minutes because I have one final question, which you'll never be able to answer this quickly, but I do think it's a good note to let people end on. And I just want to remind people, this is the book. Please think about buying it and reading it because it's really quite excellent and very, very intriguing and important book, I think, to read at this point in the world history. And so just, I know this is impossible to answer quickly, but I was thinking, you sort of hinted at the beginning, I think the United States has always felt, or people here have felt, Latin America, they have all these totalitarian types, either on the left or the right. They're attracted to these charismatic authoritarians. And guess what? Turns out the United States is not so immune from that phenomenon. And I wonder, do you think that, are we not as different as it seems from people in Venezuela, or is there something in our culture that will keep us from going down that road again?
Well, yes, the two countries are very different. And yes, there are very uncomfortable similarities in terms of what's going on. I think the key thing to understand, when people talk about Venezuela, they tend to talk about socialism. Chavez called himself a socialist. He said he wanted to make it a socialist country. Maduro calls himself a socialist. They dress in red. We've learned recently you can dress in red and then call yourself something different. But Chavez, Venezuela is not a socialist country. There was never any serious attempt to dismantle the market economy in Venezuela. What Chavez was a populist. And he used socialism as a rallying cry. Socialism was a form of branding for Chavez. And so that's what he used to rally the base. But so the key element is populism. And what, one of the ways that populism works is through polarization. And it needs this us versus them mentality, dynamic. Us, the people, I'm the leader, I represent the people, and we are positioned against the enemy, which is the elite and, some foreign enemy. And so that's really what Chavez built his movement on, and maintained his popularity through. We've seen that in this country in terms of the deepening polarization in this country. And, people think, oh, well, how could Trump be like Chavez? Trump's on the right, Chavez is on the left. Well, populism doesn't really distinguish. There's plenty of populists from one side or the other. The sort of ideology that they associate with isn't the essential element. It's the political form of maintaining power through populism. And also one of the things that has happened in Venezuela, it's what they tend to call hybrid regimes now, which is this pattern of coming to power through democratic elections, and then once you get in power, undermining the institutions of democracy so that you can stay in power permanently. And we see that in places like Hungary, Russia, to lesser degree Poland, certainly Turkey. There's an election in Brazil on Sunday where we'll see what happens with Bolsonaro. The president of Brazil is very much a populist and a Trump acolyte. And then, of course, we've seen in this country all sorts of attempts to overturn an election or dismantle the institutions that make elections work. So the U.S. is much bigger than Venezuela. The economy is much more complicated. I remember just by chance, Trump was elected in 2016, and I had this trip scheduled to Venezuela for a few days after the election, not knowing that Trump was going to win. And so I fly to Venezuela a few days after the election, and a lot of my friends there said, okay, now it's your turn. You're going to see what it's like to have a demagogue and a populist as president. And then a beat later, they would say, but at least the US has strong institutions. In other words, they thought, okay, in Venezuela, Chavez could sort of take over because we had weak institutions, the courts, the political parties, et cetera. And I said, don't be so sure, because we're going to have a Congress that's controlled in both houses by the same party as the president, just as things have been in Venezuela. They're going to pack the courts so that, one of the things in Venezuela is that the courts would all do what the government said, what the Chavez or Maduro said, because of the influence they had and because of the people they'd put in there. And then the electoral authorities are also very vulnerable. And so we found out that the US institutions, to some degree, held up, but they're extremely vulnerable. So, a demagogue, a populist, and this method of undermining the institutions of democracy to stay in power, that can happen in countries. Well, it's happening all over the world, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much. I'm not going to let us leave on a disheartening note, but I hope that one of the things that is important about history is that it teaches us what's happened in other places and in other times, and very important to read books like this that help us see what happens when we let democratic institutions fall apart. Not that there was such a strong grounding to begin with, maybe in Venezuela. But this has been such a fascinating and interesting conversation. Rebecca, thank you for putting up in the chat while we've been talking various archival materials that we have at the AJHS that are related to this conversation. I hope people in the audience will take advantage of that, because I believe, maybe naively, that education and learning and reading is a very good antidote to ignorance and the forces of darkness. So thank you very much, Willie Neuman, for enlightening us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, and thank you for your kind words about the book. And once again, thanks to the American Jewish Historical Society and to you and Rebecca. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you. Bye-bye.